The snow had been falling since before dawn, and by evening it no longer felt like weather but a decision the world had made. It covered the road in a pale silence that swallowed sound and direction alike. Eliza May Carter walked with her head bent, her breath shallow, her shawl pulled tight though it was too thin for December. At her side her father Tomas leaned heavily on a crooked stick, each step costing him something he no longer had to spare. Yet he did not complain, not once, not even when the wind cut sideways and stole warmth from bone. They had already been turned away 3 times. One door closed softly with apologies. Another shut with the excuse of sickness. The third did not bother with words at all. Eliza accepted each refusal the same way she accepted hunger, quietly, with a nod that protected what little pride she had left. She was 26, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with adornment, her face shaped by endurance rather than ease. Widowhood had come early, leaving her with hands skilled only in cooking other people's meals and a future that did not seem to remember her name. Tomas had once been strong, a man whose shoulders carried iron and children both, but age had narrowed him, folded him inward. His hair was white now, not from fashion but from years that had taken more than they gave back. The long walk made his legs tremble, and Eliza felt each tremor as if it ran through her own body. Christmas Eve crept closer with every step, a night meant for fire and bread and voices, not for open roads and unanswered prayers. The cabin appeared at the edge of the trees like a rumor, half buried in snow, smoke rising thin and straight as a held breath. Eliza slowed, uncertain, because cabins meant men and men meant judgment, and she had learned the cost of asking too much. Then the door opened and the man stepped out, tall enough that the falling snow seemed to hesitate around him. He wore no coat. His chest was bare to the cold, marked by old scars and quiet strength. His hair hung dark and long, and his eyes held the depth of someone who had learned silence early. Nocona Grey Wolf watched them approach without moving, his presence both solid and unreadable. The stories people told about men like him were loud and wrong, full of fear shaped into certainty, but he did not look at Eliza as if she were a trespasser or a weakness. He looked at Tomas first, at the way the old man's weight sagged forward, at the way his grip slipped on the stick. Something passed through Nocona's face then, not pity, but recognition. Eliza stopped a careful distance away and lifted her chin. Her voice was steady when she spoke, though her hands shook. She told him her father could not walk much farther. She told him the night was too cold and the snow too deep. She did not mention the doors or the refusals, or the way hope had thinned with every mile. She asked only for one night, only for Christmas, only for shelter until morning found them again. Nocona did not answer right away. The wind filled the space between them, carrying the smell of pine and smoke, and something like restraint. Eliza felt the weight of his silence as keenly as she felt the cold. She wondered if this was the moment she would finally break, if pride would crack before survival. Tomas shifted beside her, breath rasping, and she placed a hand on his arm, a small promise she did not know how to keep. At last Nocona stepped aside. He did not gesture, did not explain. He simply opened the door wider, and turned back toward the fire inside. Eliza exhaled a breath she had been holding since before sunset. She guided her father forward, gratitude sharp and aching in her chest. As they crossed the threshold, warmth brushed her skin like a memory she had almost forgotten. Inside, the cabin was simple and clean, the fire low but steady. Nocona brought water without being asked, set it close to Tomas, then returned to his place by the hearth. He did not stare. He did not demand thanks. Eliza understood then that this night had already changed something, though she could not yet name what it was. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time it did not feel endless. The warmth inside the cabin rose slowly, as if the fire were shy about touching strangers, yet it crept toward Eliza and Tomas with a gentleness they had not known in months. Eliza guided her father to a low bench beside the hearth, her hands trembling from cold and exhaustion, though she tried to hide both beneath steady movements. Nocona Grey Wolf added a single log to the flames, his touch deliberate, his silence neither harsh nor expectant. It felt like a room carved out of winter's sternness, a place where words were allowed to rest unopened. Tomas leaned back with a sigh that carried years of weight, and Eliza felt that sound settle into her chest, half relief, half ache. She lowered herself beside him, and unwrapped the damp shawl from her shoulders, steam lifting softly as the heat found her skin. Nokona did not turn to watch them, yet she sensed a quiet awareness in him, a presence rooted like an old pine. Snow hissed against the windowpanes, but inside the world held stillness, the first kind they had known since before sickness, before loss, before her husband's family scattered them like wind-blown ash. Nokona moved to a shelf and returned with a clay bowl filled with broth, simple but fragrant, carrying hints of venison and herbs. He placed it before Tomas first, bending slightly as if honoring age itself rather than offering charity. Tomas murmured thanks, though his voice wavered with fatigue. When Nokona handed a second bowl to Eliza, their hands brushed, a fleeting contact that startled her with its warmth. She whispered gratitude, her voice small but sincere, and he inclined his head in a gesture that felt older than language. She ate slowly, letting the broth melt the tightness in her stomach, letting its warmth fill places she had kept empty for pride's sake. Nokona sat across from them, cross-legged near the fire, his posture disciplined yet at ease. Whenever the wind howled, he glanced toward the door as though listening for something only he could hear. Eliza noticed the faint tremor in his breath when the flames shifted, as if the memory of battles or winters long past lived somewhere behind his ribs. Tomas finished first, leaning back with closed eyes, and Eliza tucked the blanket around him, as the fire painted faint gold across his worn features. She looked at Nokona then, truly looked, and wondered who had taught him such restraint and kindness. The fire crackled lightly, shedding sparks that drifted upward like small, determined souls. Eliza spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, telling Nokona she had not meant to trouble him on a night meant for peace. She explained they had tried in town, that doors shut faster than hope could form, that she understood people feared what they did not know. Her words fell like fragile offerings between them. Nokona listened without turning his gaze away from the flames, his expression unreadable but not cold. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the low, calm cadence of someone who used sound sparingly. He told her that winter was no enemy to the strong but cruel to the weary, and no one should face it without shelter. He said nothing more, yet Eliza felt layers inside her shift, the way earth moves quietly before spring. She felt seen in a way that did not ask her to be anything other than tired. Tomas stirred softly, murmuring something from a half-dream, and Nokona's eyes flickered toward him with concern that seemed instinctive. Eliza marveled at how easily he noticed suffering without stepping into it carelessly. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, a reminder of the world that had cast them out. Later, as Tomas drifted into deeper rest, Eliza stood, uncertain, and offered to tend the fire or prepare something or help however she could. She feared debt more than cold, feared being a burden even in kindness freely given. Nokona rose slowly, towering yet calm, and motioned for her to sit again. He told her the fire needed nothing. It knew its work. His voice held the faintest softness when he added that she should rest, for dawn was distant, and strength had a way of slipping from people who never paused. She obeyed, though her heart fluttered with unease. Rest had become a luxury she rarely permitted herself. She watched him as he moved around the room, adjusting covers, checking the windows, adding wood only when needed. Each motion held discipline, shaped by a life of responsibility rather than comfort. She wondered how long he had lived alone, how many winters had passed without a voice answering his. A question burned quietly in her, unspoken but present. Why had he helped them so quickly when others had not? She did not ask. He had offered shelter without questions, and she felt that silence deserved respect. The hours deepened into something soft and slow, the fire warming the air until it felt like a blanket woven from light. Nokona stepped outside briefly, opening the door to a rush of icy wind, and Eliza glimpsed the world he walked through. White, endless, merciless. When he returned, shaking snow from his hair, she saw the cold glisten on his skin, and realized how unbothered he seemed by it, as though winter bowed to him alone. Tomas woke enough to sip water, whispering her name with the gratitude of a child, and she pressed his hand gently. She told him they were safe for the night, and he nodded before drifting toward sleep again, his breathing steadier. Nokona watched them quietly, not intruding, and something about his gaze held the weight of someone who understood what it meant to carry others. Eliza felt a fragile peace settle inside her, a peace she feared would shatter with morning. Yet for tonight, the world was softer, and softness felt like a gift she had forgotten how to hold. As the fire dwindled to deeper embers, Nokona finally spoke again, asking without judgment where they had come from and how far they had walked. Eliza answered carefully, not wanting to spill her entire life into a man's hands without knowing how he would hold it. She told him only the necessary truths: that her husband had died in spring, that her in-laws cast her aside in autumn, that winter found her with little work and fewer friends. She did not yet speak of hunger or humiliation, or the long nights spent in borrowed corners. Nokona accepted her words without pressing for more. His silence did not feel like distance. It felt like respect, the kind rarely given to a woman who had been measured and dismissed by others. The fire's glow stretched over them like a quiet promise, and in that moment Eliza realized how long it had been since she felt the world slow down enough for her to breathe without shame. Midnight crept closer, the kind of hour that blurs strength and vulnerability. Nokona began clearing space near the hearth, arranging blankets to form a bed for Eliza while leaving the bench for Tomas's aching bones. She tried to protest, but he lifted a hand in a gentle motion that told her the decision was already made. She whispered that she would repay his kindness somehow, someday, but Nokona looked at her with a calm firmness and said repayment belonged to debts, and there was none here. His words disarmed her, unraveling the knot of fear always twisting beneath her ribs. She lay down cautiously, feeling the heat of the fire brush her cheek, and for the first time in months her body loosened into true rest. Tomas slept deeper now, and she listened to the slow rhythm of his breath as if it were a hymn. Nokona sat near the door, his silhouette carved against the faint orange glow, watching the storm as though guarding them from the unseen. The cabin swelled with a silence that did not judge, a silence that felt like kindness itself. Just before sleep claimed her, Eliza opened her eyes once more and found Nokona still awake, still listening to a world she could not hear. In the hollow hush between the flames and the storm, she sensed something unspoken forming in the air, something vast and quiet that neither of them had invited but both had felt. It was not love, not yet, but it was the shape of a future she had never dared imagine. And as her eyes closed at last, the cabin shuddered softly under a fierce gust of wind, a warning or a promise she could not tell, but it whispered one truth all the same. Nothing about tomorrow would be the same as today. Morning rose slowly over the cabin, its pale light filtering through frost-rimmed windows like a shy visitor unsure if it was welcome. Eliza woke to the soft crackle of the fire, and the steady rhythm of her father's breathing, a sound that soothed and unsettled her at the same time. Safety was a fragile thing, easily lost, easily taken, and she had learned never to trust it fully. She sat up carefully, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders, and found Nokona near the door, sharpening a blade with movements so measured they seemed part of the quiet itself. He looked over once, acknowledging her awakening without intruding, and something in his gaze steadied the trembling she tried so hard to hide. The snow outside had not stopped, but daylight softened it, making the world appear gentler than it truly was. Eliza folded her hands in her lap, feeling the familiar ache of everything she had carried. She knew the story inside her needed air, though speaking it felt like peeling skin from bone. Yet silence, too, could become a weight that crushed. Nokona set the blade aside and stirred the fire, adding a log with a tenderness that contradicted the steel of his build. Tomas slept on, lost in a peace he had seldom found in recent months. Eliza watched her father's chest rise and fall, remembering how strong he had once been, how his laugh used to fill rooms the way sunlight filled open doors. Now he was small and brittle, worn down by years that took more than they gave. She smoothed a stray lock of his white hair, and felt the sting of helplessness. Nokona sat across from her, waiting without expectation, offering silence like an open hand. She drew a slow breath and allowed her voice to find its way into the warm air between them. She began with the easy pieces, the parts that did not cut. She told him about the early months after her husband died, how the house had grown hollow and cold, how she tried to keep his memory alive in small ways. Her husband had been gentle, though not strong, and illness carried him quickly, leaving her with debts she could not pay, and a family that looked at her, as though she were a reminder of everything they wished to forget. She described Henry Bell, her husband's brother, a man whose cruelty took the form of quiet dismissals and calculated indifference. He told her that women should know their place, that grief made her unreasonable, that her presence burdened a household already stretched thin. At first she tried to ignore him, hoping time would soften his edges, but time revealed he had none. When her usefulness ran out, he spoke the final sentence not with anger but with boredom. He said she should leave, that the house was not hers, that her father was her responsibility, not theirs. He handed her a small bag of coins as if dispensing payment to a servant, and closed the door before she could answer. Eliza felt her throat tighten as she recounted this, but she did not look away from Nocona. The firelight warmed her cheeks, turning sorrow into something almost beautiful. Nocona listened with an attention so steady it felt like shelter. His stillness was not indifference but reverence, a kind of witnessing she had never known. Eliza continued, explaining how she and her father moved from house to house, her cooking traded for temporary beds, gratitude turning into shame as days became weeks. Some families were kind, offering what little they had, while others saw her as someone convenient to use and forget. She learned to swallow pride faster than hunger. She learned to smile even when her hands shook from cold or exhaustion. She learned that a woman alone was always being measured, always being judged by standards she never agreed to. Through every season of hardship, she held her father upright, keeping hope alive even when it flickered like a lantern starved of oil. When winter came early, she accepted any work she could find, stirring pots in kitchens that smelled of comfort she was never allowed to keep. She spoke of nights spent beneath roofs that did not feel like roofs, of mornings when frost etched the corners of her borrowed rooms. She spoke of exhaustion that seeped into her bones like slow-moving ice. Tears gathered in her eyes, not falling, simply shining there, suspended by the sheer strength she had grown from necessity. Nocona remained motionless, yet his presence wrapped around her like a blanket of honor. His expression did not twist with pity, and that alone made her breathe easier. She wondered aloud whether the world had always been this harsh, or if she had simply noticed it more since losing everything familiar. Her voice softened when she spoke of Tomas, of how he tried to shield her from worry, even as his legs failed him. She told Nocona she feared the day her father could no longer walk at all, feared being unable to care for him in a world that seldom cared back. As she spoke, Tomas stirred, his frail hands tightening slightly around the blanket, and Eliza paused to smooth it again. The small gesture carried the weight of years. Nocona's gaze followed her movement, understanding not just the action, but the lifetime beneath it. Then he spoke, gently, telling her strength was not measured by how much she endured alone, but by how deeply she loved despite the cost. His words struck her like warmth meeting frozen skin, painful yet relieving. She felt herself unravel just enough for breath to move freely again. The fire dimmed into a bed of glowing embers, casting soft red halos across the room. Eliza felt lighter for having spoken, though the ache remained. She looked at Nocona with something like gratitude and something like fear, unsure which feeling carried more truth. Silence swept between them again, but this silence felt changed, filled with a fragile understanding. She noticed then how Nocona's shoulders tensed whenever wind battered the door, how he watched the world as if expecting it to take something from him too. She wondered what stories lived beneath his quiet. She wondered what the world had taken from him. Before she could ask, Tomas coughed weakly, pulling her attention back to him. She leaned over him, whispering reassurance, but when she looked up again, she found Nocona staring at her with an intensity she had not seen before, as though something inside him had shifted. And in that moment, before either of them spoke, the cabin door rattled under a sudden sharp gust, as if the world outside had decided it was not finished with them yet. Morning crept into the cabin with a softness that felt almost apologetic, as though the sun feared disturbing what had settled in the night. The snow outside no longer raged but drifted in slow, thoughtful spirals, thinning at the edges of the world. Eliza woke to the scent of cedar smoke and the sound of Nocona moving quietly, his footsteps gentle for a man of such strength. Tomas slept deeply beside her, his breathing steadier than it had been in days, and she felt a moment of fragile gratitude slip through her ribs like a small warmth. When she sat up, Nocona lifted his gaze, offering a nod that held more comfort than any spoken greeting. The light resting on his face softened the hard lines around his eyes, revealing a tenderness she had only glimpsed before. She brushed hair from her cheek and felt the weight of everything she had confessed the night before settle into memory. It lingered not as shame, but as truth finally allowed to breathe. Some part of her wondered what he thought of her now, but he moved with the same quiet respect, unchanged in the ways that mattered. He prepared a simple breakfast and set it near her without ceremony, as if nourishment were something too natural to be acknowledged. She murmured her thanks, and he answered with a slight bow of his head, a gesture so subtle it felt private. As she ate, she watched him carve a piece of wood with patient strokes, the shavings gathering in small curls at his feet. Only after a long while did she realize he was shaping a tiny horse, its form rough but already spirited. When Tomas woke, stretching weakly, Nocona offered the carving to him. Tomas held it with a trembling smile, tracing the unfinished edges with reverent fingers. Eliza felt her throat tighten at the sight, for gifts had become rare companions in their lives. Nocona dismissed Tomas's gratitude with a gentle motion, as though kindness required no recognition. The moment hung between them like a lantern's glow, fragile and warm. Outside, the storm that had threatened to swallow them had softened into a white hush, and for the first time since autumn, the world felt less like an enemy. When Eliza stepped outside to fetch fresh snow for melting, the air stung her cheeks but carried a clarity she had forgotten existed. The forest beyond the cabin looked washed clean, each tree outlined in silver. The sky, pale and open, seemed to promise something she could not yet name. Nocona followed her out moments later, not to watch her but to stand beside her, his presence solid and unintrusive. He told her the worst of the storm had passed, that the path to town might reopen by tomorrow. The thought carved both hope and ache into her heart. Safety waited somewhere between those possibilities. She nodded, though her gaze lingered on the quiet landscape, afraid to imagine a life beyond this fragile peace. When she looked at him, snowflakes settled on his hair, catching light like scattered stars. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than before, and she felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. Later that afternoon, a figure approached from the trail, bundled against the cold, moving with cautious steps. Eliza tensed instinctively, but Nocona stood with the calm of someone who listened to the earth more than footsteps. When the woman came into full view, Eliza recognized Mrs. Abigail Crowley, a townswoman known for sharp eyes and a sharper understanding of human nature. Mrs. Crowley greeted them with breathless surprise, explaining she had followed tracks hoping to reach someone who knew how to guide others through the storm's aftermath. But her gaze lingered on Eliza, on Tomas resting inside, and then on Nocona, and her expression softened with something like comprehension. She asked if they were well, her voice carrying quiet worry. Eliza answered honestly, telling her they had found shelter by grace more than fortune. Mrs. Crowley nodded slowly, her eyes drifting again to Nocona with recognition that carried no fear. She had seen cruelty and kindness both, and knew which one stood before her now. The woman stayed for tea, warming her hands at the fire, while Tomas spoke faintly of old memories. She listened with patience, offering gentle words, and for a moment Eliza felt as though the world beyond this cabin had not entirely abandoned them. When Mrs. Crowley prepared to leave, she touched Eliza's arm, whispering that the town would need examining hearts after this storm, that perhaps doors would open differently now. Eliza wanted to believe her, but the ache of past rejection lingered too deeply to let hope rise unchecked. Still, Mrs. Crowley's presence left warmth behind, the kind that blooms slowly, cautiously. Nocona watched the woman depart with thoughtful eyes, as though weighing the meaning of her visit against the unspoken fears that lived beneath his own quiet. As evening approached, the sky bruised with shades of lavender and pale gold, Tomas dozed peacefully beside the fire. Eliza found herself sitting near Nocona, close enough to feel the subtle heat radiating from him. The air held a hush that invited honesty, yet she hesitated, unsure if words would disturb the delicate balance between them. Nocona broke the silence first, telling her she carried sorrow with extraordinary strength, not as a burden but as a vow. His voice was gentle, as though he feared the wind might steal the words if spoken too loudly. Eliza felt her eyes sting, for no one had ever seen her grief as anything other than weight. She confessed she did not know what tomorrow would demand of her, that she feared returning to a world that saw her as something disposable. Nokona listened, his steady gaze offering something steadier than reassurance, a promise of recognition. The fire deepened into amber light as shadows stretched across the cabin floor. Eliza spoke about futures she had never voiced, not dreams exactly, but small longings. A place of her own, work that did not diminish her, a life where she and her father were not burdens but simply allowed to be. Her voice trembled with the vulnerability of saying such things aloud. Nokona's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of something raw inside him, something she did not yet understand. He started to speak, stopped, then tried again, as though wrestling with words too heavy to be careless. Before he could finish, Tomas stirred abruptly, calling Eliza's name in a frightened whisper. She rushed to him, smoothing his blanket, soothing him until his breath steadied. When she looked back at Nokona, he stood utterly still, his eyes shadowed by a confession unspoken, a truth held back by the sudden interruption. And in that suspended heartbeat, she knew with absolute clarity that the storm outside had not been the only one beginning to break. Christmas morning rose with a hush so complete it felt as though the world held its breath, waiting for something unnamed. The snow outside glowed with a muted brilliance, softened by dawn's gentle touch, and inside the cabin the fire warmed the air with slow, steady promise. Eliza woke before Tomas, before even the embers stirred, her heart restless beneath the quiet. She sat upright, gathering her shawl, and felt the weight of yesterday's unspoken moment settle on her shoulders like another layer of winter. Nokona stood near the window, watching the pale horizon as though it carried an answer he had chased for years. His silhouette looked carved from the morning light, strong and solemn, unchanged yet altered by something neither of them had dared to address. When he turned toward her, there was a softness in his gaze that made her pulse tremble. She rose slowly, careful not to wake her father, and stepped closer, the floorboards whispering under her feet. Nokona did not move away. The faint glow caught the edges of his scars, mapping stories she longed to understand. She greeted him with a voice still fragile from sleep, and he returned the greeting with quiet warmth. For a breathless moment they simply stood there, two lives shaped by hardship, bound now by something delicate and growing. Eliza looked out the window beside him, seeing the storm's remnants scatter like old fears dissolving. The trail seemed clearer, the day more welcoming. Yet with that clarity came a sharp, cold truth: they could leave now. The thought pierced her with a sadness she had not prepared for. Leaving meant safety. Leaving meant returning to a world that had never made room for her. Leaving meant losing the one place where she had felt seen without judgment. Nokona must have sensed the shift in her, because he asked if she feared the road ahead. She almost laughed, except the ache in her chest made the sound too tender to escape. She told him she feared many things: being unwanted again, being reduced to a burden, being swallowed by the same loneliness she had spent months outrunning. She spoke carefully, yet the words still trembled. She admitted she did not know where to go anymore, that survival felt different now after knowing a shelter that asked for nothing in return. Her confession hung between them like breath in cold air. Nokona listened with his whole being, every line of his posture attentive. When she finished, he remained silent, not because he lacked words, but because he weighed each one before letting it live. Tomas stirred then, calling her name faintly, and Eliza turned to tend him. She helped him sit upright, wrapped him in a blanket, and guided a warm drink to his hands. His eyes, still clouded with sleep, brightened when they found Nokona. Tomas thanked him again for saving them from the storm, but his words carried more meaning now, shaped by understanding rather than gratitude alone. When he drifted back into rest, Eliza remained at his side for a moment, smoothing the blanket, fighting the rising tide of emotion. She had always been the one to carry him, to carry everything, but here she had not carried anything alone. When she stood again, Nokona was closer, watching her with a tenderness he did not bother hiding. He stepped toward the fire and picked up something wrapped in soft doeskin. He held it for a long moment before offering it to her. Eliza hesitated, unaccustomed to receiving anything that was not necessity or pity. But Nokona's expression held neither. Carefully she unwrapped the bundle, and found a small wooden carving of a woman standing beside an elder, both figures shaped with reverent detail. Her breath caught as she traced the smooth lines with shaking fingers. It was her and Tomas, strong, enduring, unbroken. The truth of it struck her so deeply, she had to press a hand to her mouth to steady herself. She whispered his name, barely sound at all. Nokona's voice was low when he told her. He carved it to remind her of what she carried, not what she had lost. Tears warmed her cheeks before she realized they had fallen. No one had given her a gift in years. No one had honored her story with gentleness. No one had seen her strength as something worthy of memory. She whispered that she did not deserve such kindness, and Nokona shook his head with quiet certainty. He stepped closer, close enough that she felt the heat of him, close enough that the world outside disappeared. He told her she had walked through storms alone that would have broken most, that she had protected her father with a fierceness few possessed, that her heart had remained soft despite every cruelty laid upon it. His words unlocked something inside her she had kept locked for survival's sake. She tried to speak, tried to thank him, tried to say something that matched the gravity of his understanding, but emotion tangled every attempt. She lowered her gaze, breath uneven. That was when Nokona lifted her chin gently, his touch warm and steady. He told her there was something he had held back, something he could no longer bury beneath silence. His voice thickened, edged with vulnerability she had never imagined in him. He confessed that the night she arrived, weary and frightened yet still standing, something inside him shifted. He confessed he admired her strength, her tenderness, the way she carried love instead of bitterness. He confessed he had not expected to feel anything for another soul again, yet she had walked into his life like a quiet prayer answered in snow. Eliza's heart thrashed with shock, fear, and a dawning hope so bright it almost hurt. She whispered that she had nothing to offer a man like him, nothing but broken pieces. Nokona stepped closer, his breath mingling with hers, and told her he did not wish for perfection, only truth. He told her he wanted her to stay, not out of need, not out of charity, but out of choice. Her knees weakened at the sheer honesty of it. She looked at him, seeing not the giant the world feared but the man who had given her and her father warmth, dignity, and now something almost unimaginable, a future. Before she could answer, Tomas shifted awake, calling for her with urgency. Eliza rushed to him, heart pounding. When she turned back to Nokona, his expression held a mixture of hope and fear, as if he had given her the most vulnerable part of himself. And in the fragile quiet that followed, she realized the snowfall outside had almost stopped, leaving the path ahead open, yet suddenly more complicated than she ever expected.